So now on to nutrients. Nutrients are any ingested chemical that's used for growth, repair, or maintenance of the body. There are 6 classes of nutrients. There are 4 macronutrients because they have to be consumed in relatively large quantities, and there are 2 micronutrients. So water, carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins are the macronutrients, whereas vitamins and minerals are only required in very small quantities, and thus they are micronutrients. We have recommended daily allowances in the United States, and this is a safe estimate of daily intake that would meet the nutritional needs of most healthy people. The RDAs are fairly liberal, so consuming less than the RDA of a nutrient doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be malnourished. The probability of malnutrition obviously increases in proportion to the amount of the deficit and how long the deficit lasts. There are some nutrients that cannot be synthesized by the body. These are called essential nutrients. Minerals, most vitamins, 8 of the amino acids, and 1 to 3 of the fatty acids need to be consumed in the diet because our body just can't synthesize them. Let's first look at carbohydrates because they are the most prevalent nutrient. A well-nourished adult has about 440 grams of carbohydrate actually in their body at any given moment. Most of that is in muscle glycogen. The next largest portion is found in the liver glycogen, and then 15 to 20 grams of it, a very small portion, will be found in blood glucose. Glycogen is the storage form of carbohydrate. So if we consume carbohydrates, they'll get digested, packaged away as glycogen, stored in the muscles, stored in the liver, and some is free and circulating and ready to be used. Sugars have many different functions. They're structural components of several other molecules, including nucleic acids, deoxyribose, and glycoproteins, glycolipids, the root glyco tells you the sugar, adenosine triphosphate, and some related nucleotides like guanosine triphosphate and cyclic AMP that we've seen utilized in second messenger systems. Most sugars function as fuel. They're easily oxidized and thus release energy quickly. Most cells meet their energy needs by using a combination of carbohydrates and fats. However, neurons and erythrocytes depend solely on carbohydrates. So even a brief period of hypoglycemia causes the nervous system to have disturbances, which are seen as weakness or dizziness or even grumpiness. Blood glucose concentration is very closely regulated, as you learned in the chapter on endocrine system. Insulin and glucagon play back and forth to regulate the balance between glycogen and free glucose or blood sugar. Carbohydrate intake influences the metabolism of other nutrients. This is why it's really unwise to try and burn off fat by reducing carbohydrate intake, things like the Atkins diet and such. Because complete and efficient oxidation of fats depends on adequate carbohydrate intake. It also depends on the presence of certain intermediates of carbohydrate metabolism, and we'll look into those shortly. Our recommended daily allowance for carbohydrates is 125 to 175 grams. Now, the brain alone consumes about 120 grams of glucose today. And since carbohydrates are the primary fuel and are oxidized so rapidly, they are required in much greater amounts than any other nutrients. Consumption of enough carbohydrates in our society doesn't seem to be too much of a problem. We have a very, very high consumption. Each individual in the United States, on average, consumes 60 pounds of sugar and 46 pounds of corn syrup each year. Over a century ago, Americans consumed an average of 4 pounds of sugar a year. So we are grossly in excess of our needs of sugar consumption. When you think about it, many of these packaged products are so highly based on high fructose corn syrup. An example, a can of non-diet soft drink has 8 teaspoons of sugar in just a 12-ounce serving. However, the consumption of sugar is a much better bet than any of the synthetic products. They may be lower in calories, but they're made from things like rat poisons. There's a whole realm of exploration you can do in the synthetic sugar realm. If anyone wanted to take that on as a final presentation, that would be welcome. So the three principal forms of carbohydrates. There's monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. The monosaccharides are going to be glucose, galactose, and fructose. They arise from digestion of starch and disaccharides. As you'll recall from our chapter on digestion, the small intestine and liver convert galactose and fructose into glucose, so ultimately all carbohydrate digestion is going to generate glucose. And outside the hepatic portal system, the only blood sugar we see is glucose. Normal blood sugar concentrations range from about 70 to 110 milligrams per deciliter. Disaccharides are carbohydrates composed of two monomers. Sucrose is table sugar, maltose, and then lactose, the sugar that we see in milk. And then polysaccharides are known as complex carbohydrates. These are starch, glycogen, and cellulose. However, cellulose is not considered a nutrient for us because we cannot digest cellulose. It's the major component of cell walls of plants, so it's very important as dietary fiber. However, we'll get no nutritional value from it. Pretty much all dietary carbohydrates come from plants. Sucrose is refined from sugarcane and sugar beets. Fructose is present in fruits and in corn syrup, as in high fructose corn syrup. That's another topic of interest if you wanted to take that on as a final presentation. The prevalence of high fructose corn syrup and how it acts to promote obesity in our society. It's much deeper than you think. Maltose is present in germinating cereal grains. And then lactose, as we already know, is found in cow's milk. Dietary fiber is fibrous material of plant and animal origin that resists digestion, so it can't be broken down and nutrients cannot be gained from it. So cellulose, pectins, some gums, and lignans. Fiber is very important in our diet, and it's recommended that we consume at least 30 grams a day. There are two basic types of fiber. First of all, there's water-soluble fibers like pectin that we find in things like oats and beans and peas, brown rice, and fruits. And these aid mostly to decrease the blood cholesterol and low-density lipoprotein levels. These are the bad cholesterols. Water-insoluble fiber, like cellulose or hemicellulose or lignin, don't really affect the cholesterol and LDL levels. But it does absorb water in the intestines and acts to soften the stool. Thus, it increases the bulk as it swells, stretches the colon, stimulates peristalsis, and thus hastens the passage of feces through the digestive tract. There is no clear evidence that there's an effect on decreasing the incidence of colorectal cancer. In fact, taking too much fiber can actually interfere with absorption of other nutrients such as iron and calcium and magnesium, phosphorus, and some other trace elements. So just like everything else, a balance is very important. Now on to lipids. A reference male and a reference female have 15 and 25% body fat respectively. Fat accounts for most of the body's stored energy. Well-nourished adult meets about 80 or 90% of their resting energy needs from fat. That's because fat's a superior storage molecule than any carbohydrate. First of all, carbohydrates are hydrophilic, and thus they absorb water, so they expand and occupy much more space in the tissues. And fat, being hydrophobic, contains almost no water, and so it has much more compact size for energy storage. Fat is also less oxidized than carbohydrates, so it contains over twice as much energy. It has about 9 kcals per gram instead of 4 that we see in carbohydrates. Fat also has a glucose-sparing and protein-sparing effect. Glucose-sparing results because the catabolism of fat leaves glucose around for consumptions by cells that cannot use fat, like the neurons. And it's protein-sparing because if we're metabolizing fat, protein is not catabolized or used for fuel, and thus we maintain our own protein. Usually protein's only broken down in a state of starvation. The fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K are absorbed with dietary fat, so it's very important that we consume enough fat each day so that we can get these vitamins across the brush border. It's said that ingestion of less than 20 grams a day. Lipids have a very diverse array of functions. Besides being an energy source, they have structural functions, and they act as chemical precursors to many other molecules. Structurally, remember phospholipids are the major component of cell membranes. Cholesterol also acts in the cell membrane to keep some fluidity around. We'll also see them in myelin. Lipids are also chemical precursors for many other molecules. For example, we've already explored cholesterol as a precursor to the steroid hormones like estrogen and testosterone. It's also a precursor to bile salts, and as you know, vitamin D. Thromboplastin is a lipoprotein that's an essential blood clotting factor. And also fatty acids act as precursors for things like arachidonic acid and linoleic acid, which are precursors to the hormone prostaglandins and some other eicosanoids. Lipids also have a very important function in protecting and insulating cells. For example, myelin in the nervous system. So how much fat should we really consume? Well, the recommended daily allowance says about 30% of your daily caloric intake needs to be fat. And that the typical American seems to get about 40 or 50% of their calories from fat. Now, if we take an Eastern perspective, the numbers might be a little bit different because we have to note that there is a serious difference between living fat and processed fat. So from an Eastern perspective, so long as all of your fats are living, like uncooked olive oils, unpasteurized milk fat, that these fats are necessary for keeping the system lubricated. There are essential fatty acids that must be consumed. Most of the fatty acids we need are going to be synthesized by the body. However, linoleic acid is certainly an essential fatty acid. It needs to be consumed in our diet. Arachidonic acid may also be an essential fatty acid. However, so long as we have enough linoleic acid, people seem to show no signs of fatty acid deficiency, and it just requires about 1 to 2% of our total energy intake to come from linoleic acid. Remember, there are saturated fats and unsaturated fats, as well as cholesterol. Saturated fats are pretty much all from animal origin, things like meat, egg yolks, and all dairy products. Unsaturated fats are predominantly vegetable oils. Olive oils, they're found in nuts, they're found in seeds. And then cholesterol is found in egg yolks, cream. It's also found in shellfish, so like crabs and shrimp are very high in cholesterol. Organ meats, and most other meat. You don't really find cholesterol in foods that are of plant origin. So what's all the buzz about lipoproteins? Here we're going to gain an understanding. First of all, lipids are a very important part of the diet. As we learned, they're precursors to many other molecules, and they have a large involvement in structure. Therefore, they have to be transported to all the cells of the body. However, lipids are hydrophobic, so they don't dissolve in the blood plasma. So we've come up with some really neat ways to solve this. These are called lipoprotein complexes. They're basically the buses that carry lipids around through our circulatory system. They're tiny droplets that have a core of cholesterol and triglycerides, and then they're coated with proteins and phospholipids. These coatings allow the lipid to be suspended in the blood, and they also serve as recognition markers so that cells that absorb them know they're there and can connect to them and absorb their contents. You can see there's a variety of different kinds of lipoproteins with varying protein content. They're classified into 4 major categories by their density. The higher the proportion of protein there is to lipids, the higher the density they are. So the lowest of the lowest density of lipoproteins are chylomicrons that we observed being absorbed by the small intestine. And then we see VLDLs, or very low density lipoproteins. Even more dense or smaller than that are low density lipoproteins. And then high density lipoproteins. They have the highest proportion of protein to lipid. First, let's look at chylomicrons. Chylomicrons were from the absorptive cells of the small intestine, and we saw that they entered the lymphatic system and then the bloodstream. Once the chylomicrons meet the capillary endothelial cells, they'll run into lipoprotein lipase, which hydrolyzes the triglycerides into monoglycerides and free fatty acids. The resulting free fatty acids and glycerol enter the adipocytes, and that's where they're resynthesized into triglycerides for storage. The remainder of the chylomicrons, called chylomicron remnants, after the triglycerides have been extracted, are going to be removed and degraded by the liver. So VLDLs are produced by the liver and act to transport lipids to adipose tissue for storage. When the triglycerides are removed in the adipose tissue, the VLDL becomes an LDL and contains mostly cholesterol. These LDLs are absorbed by their target cells through the method of receptor-mediated endocytosis. It's absorbed by cells that have a need for cholesterol that's used in membrane repair or steroid synthesis. Inside the cell, they're digested by lysosomal enzymes to release the cholesterol for intracellular use. Now, HDLs are the good lipoproteins. Their production begins in the liver. They produce an empty, collapsed protein shell. The shell travels through the blood and picks up cholesterol and phospholipids from other organs. When it passes through the liver again, the cholesterol is removed and eliminated in bile as either cholesterol or bile acids. So the HDL function is as a vehicle for removing excess cholesterol from the body. So having a lot of HDL is not a bad thing. That brings us to the idea of total cholesterol. It's desirable to maintain plasma cholesterol levels less than 200 milligrams per deciliter. Between 200 and 239 is considered borderline high, but above 240 is considered pathological, dangerous. Most of the body's cholesterol is endogenous. It's internally synthesized rather than taken in the diet. The body compensates for variation in intake. High dietary intake lowers liver cholesterol production. Low dietary intake raises liver cholesterol production. Lowering the dietary cholesterol lowers the level by no more than about 5%. Certain saturated fatty acids are going to raise serum cholesterol level. So, modification in saturated fatty acids can lower the cholesterol by 15 or 20%. So what we mean here is by taking in less saturated fats, we're much more likely to lower cholesterol than decreasing the consumption of cholesterol itself. So take a moment here. pause the recording and produce a little diagram that shows the relationship between VLDLs, LDLs, and HDLs. Think about how the VLDLs transport lipids for storage, and then they become LDLs, and the LDLs are absorbed by receptor-mediated endocytosis, and then how any byproducts released by the cells would be picked up by the HDLs. Consider where the liver is involved. So pause here a moment. Make that diagram. So how can we counter high cholesterol levels? Exercise is the key. It happens in kind of a roundabout way. So as we exercise, the sensitivity of the right atrium to blood pressure is reduced, and thus the heart secretes less atrial natriuretic peptide, which causes the kidneys to secrete less sodium and water and raises blood volume. With raised blood volume, the lipoproteins in the blood are fairly dilute. This causes the adipocytes to produce much more lipoprotein lipase, so they can claim their triglycerides. Then the adipocytes consume more blood triglycerides. The very low density lipoprotein particles shed some of their cholesterol. That cholesterol is picked up by HDLs and it's removed by the liver. So exercise certainly acts to lower cholesterol levels. So I said before, good HDLs, because HDLs indicate that cholesterol is being removed from the arteries and transported to the liver for disposal. High levels of LDL is a warning sign because it correlates with the deposition of cholesterol in the arteries. LDLs are elevated by saturated fat intake. Cigarette smoking significantly elevates LDL, coffee consumption, as well as stress. So it's recommended that you increase the ratio of HDL to LDL with regular aerobic exercise. Stay away from smoking and saturated fats. Don't drink too much coffee, and most of all, don't get too stressed out. Here's a figure that illustrates some of the lipoprotein processing pathways. You might use this to put together your figure on how HDLs and LDLs and VLDLs are all related to each other. It's a good base. So this brings us to the end of part 2 of nutrition within our nutrition and metabolism chapter. Now you're ready to move on to part 3.